Hey scholars, this is a lecture video for chapter 4 on critical thinking. Pardon the mess in my house. We are still finishing up with having work done. We had work done on our kitchen cabinets. So we had everything that was in our cabinets was in boxes all throughout the house. They still are in boxes, but anyhow. This is on critical thinking on chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. So let's begin. Make sure you're watching the PowerPoint. Make sure you're looking at the PowerPoint that's available for this video, which is available on the same module as where you click on the video. So one thing I wanted to start off with is an overview, just reviewing the definition of critical thinking. So if you're like me and you start off reading the chapter by reading the summary, the summary for this chapter was great. I'm going to refer to it in reference and read through some of it on page 77. The authors say critical thinking is essential for problem solving and decision making. Stupidity and ignorance are impediments to critical thinking, but they're not the same thing. In other words, people who do stupid things or do things that are ignorant doesn't mean that they can't still engage in critical thinking. Becoming knowledgeable about public policy controversies and thinking through the arguments is vital. At its core, critical thinking is about using reasoning and rationality to make decisions. That's the main thing. Critical thinking is about using reasoning and rationality. That's the two key things, reasoning and rationality when making decisions about just about anything. A critical thinker is skeptical but not overly cynical. So I'll stop there and then go to 69. So it's good to be skeptical, but we want to engage in and employ what's called reasonable skepticism. You should be reasonable about the degree to which you're skeptical about things, especially if you are doing it from the framework of being a critical thinker. If you're being a critical thinker and you're being fair and ethical, then you're not going to be overly skeptical, because there's a fine line between being skeptical and then being cynical and then just not trusting people. 69, the definition is the same thing. It's using reasoning and rationality to achieve better understanding, enhanced problem solving, and superior decision making. That was the definition from 69. So that's what it is. What are your thoughts on that? So maybe just pause and think through what the way that you've understood critical thinking prior to reading this chapter, after reading this chapter, as you're hearing me right now. What are your thoughts on critical thinking, and whether or not that was taught to you as a kid or in high school, or you observed the ways that people behave and you realize, wow, there's a lot of people who don't engage and employ critical thinking, or at least they don't do it well. So hopefully you think about that for a minute. On to slide 4. So the authors, the first section on here is Dumb and Dumberer. And one of the things they talk about is we all do dumb things. Everybody does dumb things. And one of the key themes of this chapter is the authors are talking about people who do really dumb things, and then hopefully they learn from them. And I think most people, or the majority of people, tend to learn from their mistakes, but that's what this chapter talks about. They talk about the ways that we lead to the ways that we make decisions and engage in behaviors that lead to stupid things versus ignorant things. Anyhow, yes, we all do dumb things. Doesn't mean we're dumb. So the authors talk about this concept called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is to illustrate how people do dumb things. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is basically the idea that where is that? On page 62. Oh, top 62. The poorest thinkers among us fail to realize that they're among the poorest thinkers. In other words, they think very, very poorly and they do really dumb things, but they don't realize it. They're not consciously aware of that. So then they continue doing dumb things. And that's an unfortunate cycle, but that's not the case for everyone, but that's Dunning-Kruger effect. But the authors talk about how we can use critical thinking skills and learning from our mistakes. In that same opening paragraph, hey, just because you do something stupid doesn't mean that's the end of it for you, but the silver lining is that you can always learn from your mistakes and actually learn how to think better. You can actually learn how to think better because you made a mistake. So it's important to know the difference between ignorance and stupidity. I'm on to slide 7. So think about a time that you did something that was dumb. It's fun. It's really fun to do this in a classroom where we can hear people tell their stories. So think about a time you did something dumb, and maybe hit the pause button and just really think through something that you did that you would say, like, that was really stupid. Journal about it, write down some ideas and thoughts, and then ask yourself honestly, was that because of ignorance or stupidity? And the reason why you see the face of a man who's like all red all over is because it's what's called niacin flush. So several years ago, I was taking vitamins and minerals. I always buy like vitamins and minerals to be healthy, and I started taking niacin, not knowing what the side effects were. And then I was out to lunch with my wife. She was my, I think, girlfriend at the time, or fiance at the time. I don't remember. I was out to lunch with her, and I was talking about how I was having these like hot flashes, like these red flashes where my skin would turn red. I would get so hot all over my body, and I was like, I have no idea what it was. Anyways, my wife's mother-in-law, or my wife's sister's mother-in-law, was at the table, and she knows a lot about health. She overheard what I said about the niacin, or about being hot and all that kind of stuff. And the first thing she asked me was, "Are you taking niacin?" And I said, "Yes." "How do you know?" And she's like, it's called niacin flush, and it makes your body all red and all that kind of stuff. And then she looked at me, she basically said, I was like 25 at the time, and she said, "You don't need to be taking niacin, you're healthy." So that was something I did that was dumb out of ignorance. Now, if I continued doing it, if I continued taking these supplements, then I thought like, oh, okay, I'm not going to listen to her. Like, what does she know? I'll still take it, and maybe I'll just take smaller doses of it. Well, more than likely, if I did that, I would continue getting the niacin flush, the redness, the heat. That would be stupid, right? Now that would be doing something dumb out of stupidity. So that's the difference between the two. So the authors talk about blissful versus willful ignorance. I'm on slide 8. They talk about smoking and how there was a person whose name is Sienna Miller. I don't actually know who that is, but they talk about how Sienna said, "I think the more positive approach you have to smoking, the less harmful it is." On page 63. That doesn't make any sense. That's willful ignorance. And why is it willful ignorance? Because we live in a day and age, it's 2021. We know that smoking cigarettes is bad for your health. Back in the day, when my grandma first started smoking cigarettes, she was about 14, I think 15 when she started smoking cigarettes, in 1935. She was born in 1920. So when she smoked cigarettes, over enough time, she would probably get affected by it, maybe like get a cough or get sick or something like that. But not knowing what it was, the world at large did not really understand the harmful effects of smoking cigarettes. But people continued smoking them. That's blissful ignorance, right? I'm smoking these cigarettes, but hey, rewind the clock 50, 60 years, and you're at a time where people smoke cigarettes. They don't realize that it's bad for your health. Or at least they don't have the scientific evidence that we have now that shows the long-term effect, the longevity of smoking cigarettes. So nowadays you can't pull that. You can't say, "Oh, I didn't think smoking was bad for you." It's like, no, it is. I mean, it's not. And I'm not criticizing people who smoke, but the evidence is clear that smoking cigarettes, especially in large amounts, smoking a cigarette or occasional smoking or social smoking, that's all different. The bottom line is it's bad for your health. The more you do it, the worse it is. If you have one cigarette a month, it's probably not going to hurt you, right? But my grandma was smoking 2 to 3 packs a day. So she was smoking 40 to 60 cigarettes per day for several years. That was really, really bad for health. It caused lung cancer, all that kind of stuff. Anyways, difference between blissful and willful ignorance. Another way to understand the difference is honest errors and foolishness. We oftentimes make honest errors, that's willful ignorance, but then if we continue making those errors, those same errors, knowing what we now know, then it becomes foolishness. So I had that picture there to represent a story of a family member. I feel like that picture sort of captures it somehow. Story of a family member who was lighting a fire in a living room, and the fire has a gas fire where you have a gas key, you turn the gas key on, and you light the fire. That's how you light a fire. But the first step, hopefully some of you are saying, like, the first thing you do is you pull the flue. The flue is the little lever that controls the thing that opens up the flue, or there's like a flue lever and then a flue that opens. And that way all the smoke and the gas and the heat goes through your chimney. That's the first step. And then you light the gas, turn the gas on, and then you light it with a lighter. But what this person did is she turned the gas on, but did not open the flue, And then also the gas went too long. It was turned on too high, and or it was on for too long before she lit it. And I'm not kidding. I wasn't there. I didn't see it. I just heard the stories. But when she lit it, it was like a fireball, like a literal fireball, like happened. And it was like right in her face. It singed her hair. She was okay. I don't think she went to the hospital or anything like that. But it like, singed the outer parts of her hair. And I'm guessing at that moment is when she realized, like, oh my gosh, like, something went wrong, right? The gas was on too long. I didn't open the flue. So my guess is that nowadays, I mean, this was like almost 20 years ago, but nowadays, I don't think she ever would approach a fireplace and make the same mistake, because that would be foolish, right? Because before I would chalk it up to an honest error, but now if she were to do it again, it would be foolishness. Anyhow, hopefully that is again a way to help you understand the difference. So moving on to slide 10, I have the worst and then the worst best. As we just talked about, Dunning-Kruger is when the poorest thinkers among us, they continue doing dumb things and foolish things, and they don't realize it, right? So it just keeps getting worse. The sort of the inverse of that, in a way, is what's called the illusory superiority effect, which is the idea that on 67, most people are prone to overestimate their abilities, called this illusory superiority. Most people consider themselves to be above average. They see themselves as smarter than they are, better at driving than they are, they're funnier than they are, and so on. So what the authors are saying is a lot of people tend to think that they're way better than everyone else, when the reality is that's like they're the worst best, right? That might be the case. You might have instances of someone who thinks like, I'm way better than everyone else, and maybe they are smarter and all those other kinds of things. But then we're getting into like arrogance or narcissism. But this is the idea that a lot of people overestimate their abilities for whatever, whatever your trade is, whatever the thing it is you do, people overestimate their abilities. One of the things that kind of will help us to understand this phenomenon is this idea that humans are really bad at assessing risk. There's a Freakonomics podcast that I've played in classes before, and the whole podcast is on the fact that a lot of humans do dumb things. The podcast you'll be listening to talks about that. And basically, the one of the main authors, his name is Dubner, or Stephen Dubner, and Stephen Levitt. Stephen Dubner and Stephen Levitt are the two authors of the Freakonomics book, and they do the podcast together. One's the host, one's often a guest. I always get it mixed up. But there's an economist at the University of Chicago. He talks about, he's really, really smart. So he said, humans are horrible at assessing risk. We fear the things that we don't need to fear, and we don't fear the things that we should fear. He said a lot of people are really, if we should fear something, if we want to have fears, we should be afraid of cheeseburgers and the sun and that kind of stuff, because those are the things that are actually harming us. Whereas most people have fears of things that don't harm them. A lot of people have a fear of sharks. It's a rational fear, but the likelihood of ever getting attacked by a shark, let alone getting killed by a shark, is extremely unlikely. And so one of the things they talk about on the podcast is a lot of people we're not good at assessing our own abilities and assessing risk. And so oftentimes we make poor decisions. Hence, illusory superiority effect is one concept to kind of help understand that better or exemplify it in a different way. So what is critical thinking? The authors really, spend a good amount of time talking about what it is and what it isn't, and how you learn from your mistakes. So it's important to know the differences. They talk about being critical. A lot of people, I think, tend to think of critical thinking as being critical of others, like you're criticizing. Again, there's a fine line between criticizing and then engaging in critical thinking. If you're watching a public speaker, maybe you're at some sort of an event where there's a public speaker and you find yourself criticizing them. It's like if you're criticizing them and then you're being negative, or you're saying things that are unkind or unfair, well, now you're just being overly critical. But if you're engaging in critical thinking and you're using your reasoning and rationality to better understand the message of the person being spoken, or the message that's spoken by the person, well, now we're employing critical thinking. So being critical is different than critical thinking or creative thinking. being creative doesn't necessarily mean that you're engaging in critical thinking, but the two are very, very much interrelated. If you're a very creative person, then I would say, hey, if you're naturally creative, maybe like, hey, I'd say my kids are creative. My daughter's very creative with art and whatnot. If you're naturally creative, well, if you learn more about critical thinking, you can sort of marry the two and use and utilize critical thinking to enhance your ability to be creative. So that's how you can use these tools, right? Think of this textbook as a toolbox. It's tools that help you with thinking and reasoning and enhancing your understanding of the world that we know, social phenomena, etc. So it's important to have some theoretical support onto slide 12. Understanding the theoretical backing for this concept of critical thinking is important. The more you understand something, the better, right? When you understand the theoretical explanations for any sort of human phenomenon, you tend to understand it better. The theory the authors provide is the elaboration likelihood model. And in general, the more you understand that theory, you understand all the different things that help explain it, it improves your skill as a critical thinker. So one thing I wanted to point out is with regards to elaboration likelihood model, I'll just refer to it as ELM. It's a theory used a lot in persuasion. It's persuasion theory. It's a theory that's relevant for all kinds of disciplines, not just persuasion. But ELM, I'll refer to it as ELM. But I just want to point out what the authors mentioned on the bottom of page 72. They talk about how ELM is relevant to a topic versus how the topic relates to its audience, to its demographic. So let's say advertisements, commercials. Maybe you work for the city, or you're a politician. You're thinking of, how do I craft a message that's tailored towards a specific audience? Well, they talked about how if you had a talk, if you had a talk on the topic of birth control for senior citizens, again, this is the author's dry sense of humor, in my opinion. If you had senior citizens listening to a talk on birth control, they just don't have the motivation to listen to it for hopefully what would be obvious reasons to you. They have the ability, of course they know how to listen to it, but they don't have the motivation. So they can't really employ ELM, or they're not likely to employ ELM and higher level critical thinking. Or a talk on reverse mortgages for preschoolers. Hey, with preschoolers, you can talk to them. They're smart. They're taking it all in, but they don't have the ability. There's no way they have the ability to understand the impact of reverse mortgages. They might have the motivation. If I talked about the benefits of reverse mortgages or whatever, if I talk about benefits, hey, if we do this thing, it's going to be good for your house. Or, if I just talk about fun things that I know they'll like, they'll be motivated. But they don't know how to, they don't have the ability to process what I'm saying. So let's talk about ELM. The authors talk about it briefly, and I'm going to talk about it in more depth. I'm going to give you a somewhat comprehensive overview of ELM, but I'm still going to be as concise as I can be, but detailed. When I lecture on this topic from a persuasion theory textbook, there's an entire chapter. There's a whole chapter on elaboration likelihood model. Really, really interesting stuff. So some of the assumptions of ELM, slide 13, people are rational, or at least we have the ability to engage in rational thinking. That's like this whole chapter, right? This whole textbook. Source credibility matters. In other words, when making a decision, if I'm about to buy a car, or if I'm going to vote for someone, or if I'm going to take a new drug or a new pill, or if I'm going to do something major, and someone's trying to persuade me to do something or not to do something, source credibility matters. Like the source of the message that I'm listening to, that person or that source's credibility matters, whether it's a person or a group or an organization or a book or a website or whatever. That should matter, right? I should care about those things. But at the very least, we know how to think that way. And then evidence matters. Evidence also matters. We should be combing through evidence. We shouldn't just take something that someone's telling us. We shouldn't just accept it as true. We should be reasonably skeptical. Just because someone says, hey, did you hear this? I read it in the internet. I read it on a book. I heard it in an interview. It was said by this person who's a doctor. Well, just because a person's a doctor doesn't mean that the things that they say are actually correct. The evidence matters, but you have to look at the evidence. You have to really weigh the evidence. So those are the assumptions of ALM. Slide 14. The fact of the matter is, oftentimes we just want a mental shortcut. As humans, we like mental shortcuts. Oftentimes we don't like to engage in critical thinking. Critical thinking is great. It's a great tool. But to do it a lot is tiring. It's very tiring. At least for some than others, at the very least. So, on to slide 15. You'll understand the whole mental shortcut thing in just a second. Slide 15 talks about elaboration. So what is elaboration? It's basically processing information. You see an advertisement that says you should do this, you should stop doing this, you should stop smoking, you should start recycling, you should change your diet, you should exercise, you should vote for this person, you should think differently. Think about messages like that. So elaboration refers to the amount of processing. How much am I processing this message? And as humans, we typically take one of two directions. We either take the central route or the peripheral route. Now, in reality, sometimes we do a little bit of both. I might be employing different elements of the peripheral route and different elements of the central route, but I'm just going to be talking about it in terms of the two extremes. I'm going to be talking about it as a dichotomy, as opposed to how it actually is, which is oftentimes it's a little bit of both. Central route, the central route of processing information involves high elaboration. I'm doing lots of processing. Peripheral route, low elaboration. I'm not doing a whole lot of processing. Part of what accounts for the peripheral route in terms of how to understand it better is to know that many scholars will argue that as humans, we tend to be cognitive misers. We tend to be miserly with our cognitions. In other words, we don't want to expend more effort than we need to. Not because we don't know how, not because we don't care. It's just, and in my opinion, it's just tiring. It requires a lot of thinking. It makes you tired. It's one of those things where you're sitting, you can just be sitting and reading. And if you're actually engaging in these exercises and you think this particular way, after about an hour or so, you're like, man, that's pretty tiring, right? And I didn't even get up. I'm just sitting. Because it's exercising the mind. So I'll just talk about the central route first. Sorry, I'm reading. I thought I had a typo. So for the central route, slide 16, you have to be motivated and have the ability to engage in high elaboration. Motivation is related to is a function of personal relevance, accountability, and congruent information, and need for cognition. In other words, if I'm about to watch a message, I'm gonna watch a TED Talk, right? I'm gonna see a TED Talk, and it's gonna be about some really, really interesting topic. Well, if the topic is something that has personal relevance to me, and the topic is something to which I feel sort of accountable to listen to, if I feel like this level of accountability to really pay attention to this message, and I'm provided with incongruent information, like I'm experiencing dissonance, I learn things that I'm like, I didn't know that. Like that's inconsistent with my current set of beliefs, with the status quo. And if I have a high need for cognition, a need for cognition, you can understand that I have slide 17, need for cognition, I have a link there. If you want to know what need for cognition is, NFC, you can click on that link, and that link will take you to a survey that is basically a need for cognition survey scale, where you could like take that scale and then measure your level of NFC. In short, what it is if you have a high level of NFC, then you tend to be the person who really thinks through things a lot. It's kind of like central. It's related to the central route of processing information. But in general, you just you think a lot. Maybe you say like, yes, that's me, or you experience analysis paralysis, as some people call it. When you're analyzing and thinking about something so much that it becomes paralytic, or that it creates anxiety. That's not just need for cognition, right? Some people who have an excessive high level of NFC might experience that. But NFC can be a positive thing. It could be a very positive thing. You can think of it as a skill. It's going to make me more motivated to pay attention to the message that's relevant to me. And that's motivation. And I'll explain how this all makes sense in just a second. Ability has to do with just, do I know how to process this information? Not am I motivated to, but do I know how to? This is just more like, regardless of my personal connection to it, is my brain equipped? Is my brain programmed to deal with this message in a central high level thinking way? Do I have that ability? So comprehension, if I can comprehend the message well, and repetition. If I've seen this topic, if I've seen multiple TED Talks on the same topic, I've repeated I've expose myself to this information multiple times. If it's in written format, like if I'm reading something in written form versus audible form, if I'm just hearing something versus reading something, that can increase your ability to process the message centrally. And then if I have prior knowledge, if I already knew a little bit about this topic and now I'm exposed to another message on the same topic, then I'm more likely to process it centrally. So that's the central route of processing information. So imagine that's your framework, that's your mindset as you're listening to some 20-minute TED Talk on, let's say, the process of angiogenesis. So that's the TED Talk that I have on my YouTube channel. It's part of an assignment for this class. There's a 20-minute TED Talk on the topic of cancer and food and this thing called angiogenesis. So when I first saw this TED Talk several years ago, the TED Talk's from 2009, I first saw the TED Talk and right away I was just like, all these factors of central processing were relevant to me. And I didn't realize it at the time, because at the time I saw the video, I hadn't been teaching on this theory before. I had heard of the theory, but I haven't taught on the theory. Once I started teaching on the theory, I was like, oh my gosh, now I totally understand. I was watching a TED Talk on cancer and food and all that kind of stuff, and my dad had cancer at the time. And so because of that, like my dad has cancer, I'm the one in my family who is typically the person who would broach these uncomfortable topics, like talking to my dad about cancer and different things, different ways that he can modify his life, etc. I had that personal relevance involvement. I felt accountable because I knew that other people probably wouldn't do what I'm doing. I was presented with incongruent information about the way that food works and the way that cancer treatments work. And I have, in general, I have a very, very high need for cognition. So I was highly motivated. Ability, comprehension, I understood it a little bit. I don't have a biology background, science background, but I could follow what he's saying. I have a PhD and I have a minor in statistics and quantitative research methods. So I'm familiar with the scientific stuff that he's saying, all the stats and all that kind of stuff. And then I started watching it multiple times. And then I started watching it, other documentaries and whatnot on the same topic. So written format, repetition. And then as I watched more and more things, now I was building this body of knowledge in my brain about this topic. So for me, when I read these kinds of messages or hear these kinds of messages at the time on the topic of cancer, I very much took the central route of processing information. So that's central route. I was detailed, but hopefully you were able to follow. Now the peripheral route is when you're lacking motivation or you don't have the ability, right? You're the same. You have the same TED Talk. You're watching the same TED Talk, but you're like, well, you know what? Based on everything you said, I'm not motivated, and I don't have the ability. Or I have the ability, but I'm just not motivated. Then you'll still be processing the message, but in terms of how you arrive at a decision, how you understand the message is based on peripheral processing. So we look for peripheral cues. If we're defaulting to the peripheral route of processing information, it's low elaboration, low processing. It's not as tiring, doesn't take as much time or effort or energy. So I look for things like peripheral cues, source credibility. Source credibility, like how credible is the source? In the TED Talk example, he's a medical doctor with a lot of years of experience. He has all these publications. So for a lot of people, they're like, there you go, look at that. Why would I question what he's saying? And that's not the point. The point is it's not about trusting the person, but it's about how we analyze a message. The attractiveness of the person. It could be the attractiveness of the overall appeal of the source, the appeal of a commercial. Sometimes you see a commercial and you're like, wow, that commercial was so intense and so engaging. It's attractive. You feel like a magnetic pull towards that. That's a peripheral route. And then number of arguments. So I have a link in here, a hyperlink next to the thing that says number of arguments. You can click on that. It's a 1 minute commercial on a product, on a medical product, a pharmaceutical product called Humira. And I think it had something to do with your skin. I forget exactly. I highly recommend that you watch that with this mindset of the difference between central route and peripheral route. If you're the target audience of this kind of commercial, right? One of the things that the advertisers are strategically doing is providing lots of arguments, because one of the peripheral cues, according to ELM, is the number of arguments. And in a 1 minute commercial, if you hear 30 arguments versus 15 arguments, well, according to the peripheral route, I'm going to go with the one that has 30 arguments. Whether or not they're good or accurate or honest, that doesn't matter. I mean, to a degree, it should matter. But in this instance, I'm just like, you know what? That has more arguments. There's more facts, there's more data, so I'm just going to go with that one. It's an easy choice. And oftentimes it could be a smart choice, but it's just a peripheral cue. I put in there, obsessed with numbers. The first thing that she says, the first thing the actress says in the commercial, one of the first things she says is, I'm obsessed with numbers, right? And then now she's providing lots and lots of arguments. The other one is others' reactions. So if we're assessing a message and we're not sure how to process it, right? I might look for a peripheral cue, like what's everyone else doing? How is everyone else responding to this? And if everyone else is laughing, okay, it must be funny, I'll laugh. If everyone else is making a certain concerned look, then it must be, you know, I should probably do what they're doing. We look to what other people are doing and saying in terms of how we respond to a message. So that's peripheral route. It's not so much that one is better than the other. They're different. They're different ways of processing information. They're different ways of thinking. And the central route is certainly much more consistent with the nature of critical thinking. So that's ALM. So the authors talk about this topic of technology and how it's related to critical thinking. I would hope and imagine that you found this section very, very interesting, because it sort of presented all different sides of the issue of technology and how that might be good for us or how that might be bad for us. It's showing both sides of the coin. I'm on slide 19. If any of you have seen the movie Napoleon Dynamite, hopefully you appreciate this little throwback to Napoleon Dynamite. It's one of those cult classic films that came out early 2000s. Most of you were pretty young at the time, but anyways, if you don't like the film, I'm sorry. It seemed like it made sense with technology. So the authors talk about technology. On page 74, it says, "This is your brain on the web, naysayers' criticisms." The authors are providing this research and these perspectives and opinions on how Googling has jumbled our brains, texting has made us more illiterate, right? They talk about multitasking and how people oftentimes will engage in multitasking with electronics, right? I have my cell phone, I have a mobile device, I have some other thing, I have different notifications going on, and I'm reading, and I'm on a Zoom call, and I'm doing this other thing. And one mentality is like, no, I'm good at it. I'm good at multitasking. But what the research shows, regardless of what you think, what the research shows is, when the research that talks about multitasking, they explain how our brain has a certain, let's say, bandwidth, right? Or our brain has a certain capacity for the way that we attend to tasks, for the way that we focus on tasks. So if I'm reading a book and there's nothing else going on, I have no technology, if I'm reading a book and it's just me in the book, you might say that 100% of my focus is on this task of reading. But now if I'm reading a book, and I'm also in the meantime, I'm in a text message thread, or I'm looking at email, or I'm watching a TV show, or I hear noise going on around me. Well, now my focus is partly on the book and is partly on that other things. Or if I'm listening to a lecture and then I'm texting in the classroom, or I'm texting as I'm listening to a lecture or watching a movie or hearing a conversation. You might be in a conversation with someone and you're talking to someone, and as you're talking to that person, they're on their phone doing something, texting, responding to a comment, creating a comment on some sort of social media feed, shopping, whatever, right? They're attending to their phone. That's another task. So all of a sudden now the percentage of focus is less on you, and then part of it's on the phone. Maybe it's 80% on you, 20% on the phone. 50% on you, 50% on the phone, 90% on you, 10% on the phone. It's different for everyone. But it's not uncommon to be in that situation where someone's on their phone and you say something to them and they give you one of those, oh, yeah. And you're like, what? That makes no sense that you just said that to what I just said, because if you were listening, then you wouldn't have responded that way. Right? They're just, they heard noise coming out of your mouth, but they didn't process what you're saying because they're task switching. And I know some of you might be saying, no, I'm good, I'm great at that. And that's not the point. The point is that when it comes to technology can increase the likelihood that we'll be taking the focus off of one major activity and putting that focus or borrowing the focus, taking the focus away from one task and placing it on other things. So that's part of it too. But then the authors talk about all these positive effects on technology. The benefits of playing video games on page 76. They say acronyms and abbreviations are a form of language play. Texting improves overall literacy and creates opportunities for using language in novel and entertaining ways. On 76. So for those of you who read that, as you were reading that, hopefully you were thinking like, oh my gosh, that's so awesome. It's like awesome support for the fact that I play video games and do this. But it doesn't mean that you should say like, okay, I'm going to just play more video games and I'm never going to use proper grammar. The thing to remember is, as humans, one of our goals as human communicators is to exchange meaning. Communication is an exchange of meaning. And the better that you understand language, verbal, nonverbal, and then what's more modern and nuanced is like texting and different forms of language play. Hey, that's great. But you also need to understand the basics. If you're not able to use grammar and language properly and syntax and know how to put things in order in a way that creates shared meaning, then what you're doing is you're taking away from one of the primary functions of human interaction, which is sharing meaning and exchanging meaning. And part of doing that, part of accomplishing that is challenging. I have to use language and I have to be creative in terms of how I can get you to understand this. If all I know is text talk and abbreviations and acronyms, I'm that much more limited. So it's better to have both, right? Hey, know the grammar, know all those other things. And then, hey, once you've mastered the language of a dominant language, whatever your language is, if your native language is English, once you've mastered English or you know it really, really well, then it's that much easier and you actually become that much more creative and interesting and novel with the way that you use wordplay and whatnot with technology and whatnot. That's part of it. Part of that's my opinion. Part of that's based on research as well. So technology isn't all bad. Okay, on sort of that note, let's go on to slide 20, a little movie trivia for those of you who like movies from the 80s. Look at slide 20. Hopefully maybe you recall that image. If you have a parent who's around or an older grown-up who's around who was born sometime in the 70s or early 80s, they might recognize that as well. That is the Zoltar machine from the movie Big with Tom Hanks, whose character is Josh Baskin. Josh Baskin is a 13-year-old boy. He makes a wish at a carnival. He makes a wish at the Zoltar machine at this carnival. It's slide 20. And it's a fantasy, coming-of-age movie, fantasy theme kind of thing. The next morning he wakes up and now he's a grown adult, right? And the audience knows it's Tom Hanks playing Josh Baskin. So that's the context for the film. By far one of my favorite films ever is Big. So Josh is an adult and he's like, I got to get a job. I got to get a job and I can't tell anyone. He only tells his one best friend because if anybody else found out who he was, they would think he's crazy, right? He's an adult, but he's really only 13. So he gets a job at a toy company. He knows toys really, really well. He gets a job at a toy company. He's promoted to like vice president of something really, really quickly. The irony is that the audience knows this guy knows everything about toys, but what the people he works with, they don't realize that, right? Because they just think he's an adult. So he goes to this meeting. He goes to this meeting where the main guy, his name is I think his name is Paul. In the film, his name is Paul, played by John Hurd, guy from Home Alone, the dad in Home Alone. So he's played by, his name is John Hurd. His character is Paul. Paul is giving this marketing report to this group of people in a conference room. It's very formal, right? They're looking at the toys. He's explaining all the numbers and whatnot. Now Josh comes into the meeting as a kid and he starts asking questions and he starts doing things that are very uncommon. And the way that you know that is based upon the way that you see people react to him. Plus you can just watch him and you're like, oh my gosh, that's not what you do in a meeting. So what I want you to do, this is not going to be a homework assignment, but this hopefully will be fun. Click on the link that you see where it says ELM in the workplace, that on the very top of that slide, on slide 21. Watch the scene. It's only like 2.5, 3 minutes or so. And then ask yourself, really pay attention to what's going on, what Paul is saying. Paul's the main guy leading the meeting. And then how Josh is responding, how other people are responding. Central route, peripheral route, which route are most people taking, how so. what are the implications of taking the central route, right? You're listening to Paul, but if you're responding to Paul's messages using the central route of processing, what are the implications for that? What are the implications for taking peripheral route? I'm just peripheral cues, right? He'd give me the numbers, lots of arguments. And then what about Josh exemplifying his high need for cognition? So we know Josh in the film, the audience knows he has a very high need for cognition. He wants to understand how things work. So he's definitely like a high level of central processing. What are the advantages and disadvantages of Josh doing that in the meeting? So think about it. Imagine that you're in the room with them. Imagine that you're actually there. What are the implications for Josh employing different levels of peripheral route versus central route and high need for cognition? What would you do if you were Josh? What would you do if you were in the meeting? I hope you have fun with this. It's one of my favorite films. Hopefully after seeing the scene, you'll watch the whole film. So again, that's critical thinking. The authors spent a lot of time in the chapter talking about a lot of things that people do that are dumb things and why they're dumb, and then more so like how we can learn from them, how we can grow from that by employing critical thinking skills, learning about the theory behind it, etc. All right. Hope you're all doing well. I'll talk to you later. Bye.